I am Carol Cartwright, co-chair of the Knight Commission, and I'm joined by Arne Duncan, the Commission's other co-chair. As you know, we just completed 3 very informative and engaging public sessions, and the Commission also met privately yesterday. We want to thank Mark Emmert for being with us today, and also thank all of our expert panelists. They brought a wealth of great information and good discussion to us. We especially appreciated Mark Emmert's candidness and forthrightness. It was very interesting to us when he told us about a recent survey where nearly 80% of the people surveyed believed that big universities put money ahead of their student athletes, something we clearly need to be thinking about. And 70%, according to the survey, of big schools were regarded as part of the problem when it comes to the issue and not part of the solution. Those are sobering data, and we need to take them into account. It is true that in the past few years, under Mark's leadership, we've seen progress, and it's worth noting that athletes are now graduating at a higher level than ever. Athletes are now receiving more financial benefits. They have more time off from their sports, and there are greater health and safety protections in place. And the Knight Commission supported and promoted these changes for many years. In addition, 2 major commission recommendations were adopted in recent years. One, requiring teams to be on track to graduate at least half of their players to be eligible for postseason competition. And second, including academic incentives in the NCAA March Madness revenue distributions. It took us a while, but we got there. More than $1 billion will now be rewarded to institutions between 2019 and 2032 based on the academic success of their teams. Those are the funds that will be available because of this new academic incentive. So clearly there's been progress, and it can and should be celebrated, but today's meetings and recent events leading up to this meeting highlight an overwhelming reality, and that is that 2 marquee college sports in Division I and the NCAA itself face extraordinary challenges. Our sense of urgency for change is propelled by the corrupt recruiting environment in men's basketball that was exposed by the FBI allegations of federal bribery and fraud charges brought against 10 men, including 4 assistant coaches and an Adidas executive. And more charges may be coming. Arne Duncan is going to talk about the oversight issues, and then I'll return to the podium to discuss issues with football and promoting diversity in athletics leadership, and then we'll take your questions.
Thanks so much, Carol. I don't think we're the biggest news coming out of DC today, so it's good to see you guys and have you take questions on the topics that we're here to discuss. I don't say this lightly. I really feel that college sports and the NCAA is at a bit of a crossroads today. And if you heard the sessions earlier, I think you get the sense of urgency in what's at stake. And the Knight Commission is deeply troubled by the mounting evidence that the NCAA seems to be unable to ensure a level of integrity that has to be a priority in the education and the treatment of college student athletes. These threats to the integrity of college sports compel us to act in a very different way. Status quo simply isn't working. Our meetings this morning highlighted, I think, 3 broad areas of college athletics in need of far-reaching reform: the exploitation of college athletes by shoe companies and agents, the largely unregulated structure of non-scholastic youth basketball, and changes to the NCAA's enforcement power. And with respect to the oversight of academic integrity, we are calling on the NCAA to change a rule that now effectively allows an institution under investigation to make its own determination, let me repeat that, its own determination about the academic legitimacy of its courses. The NCAA should not be handcuffed in its authority to consider independent assessments of academic fraud. Other loopholes in NCAA rules governing academic integrity, including the determination of what constitutes impermissible academic benefits for athletes, also need to be closed. We will also explore reforms to the enforcement process that expand the NCAA's range of investigative practices and tools, such as providing subpoena power. Let me be very clear. The system in place today was designed for a bygone era. We will continue to explore ideas that we have discussed over the years, including the following: how a limited antitrust exemption for the NCAA with restrictions might address some of the current problems, and whether financial benefits could be provided for the use of athletes' name, image, and likenesses. In sum, we feel compelled to give players more flexibility over their careers and provide the NCAA with the tools it needs to ensure the integrity in college sports. I'll stop there and turn it back over to Carol, and then we'll take your questions. Thank you.
So as Arne said, in our view, we clearly need a new approach. And that approach needs to be able to provide more fairness to student athletes while giving more teeth to the NCAA to ensure integrity in college sports. That's been a bedrock principle of the Knight Commission. There are several final points we want to highlight. We heard a great deal today from experts about the health and safety concerns in football, as well as gaps in medical coverage where institutions can improve. On a national level, important initiatives like concussion research are funded through revenues generated by the NCAA's March Madness College Basketball Tournament. The Knight Commission continues to press for a change so that the college football playoff devotes a portion of its revenue to address national health and safety initiatives in college football. We think they need to step up and take a leadership role, not just run a championship. Last week, the NCAA announced an additional commitment of $12.5 million for concussion research, certainly a good move. University presidents on the CFP Board of Managers have a real opportunity to provide important leadership on this issue, which is central to college football moving forward. The distribution of shared revenues is more than just a financial decision about how to divvy up the money. The distribution of revenue reflects what we choose to value in college sports. In its first 3 years, the college football playoff has generated $1.2 billion. It makes sense that a portion of these revenues be devoted to the national health and safety initiatives. We've communicated with the CFP about our recommendation, which was initially made at our May meeting this year. We hope that they will consider this issue at their January meeting. Finally, we are making a recommendation that will support the pledge signed by more than 80% of university presidents to improve diversity in college athletics leadership. We recommend that all NCAA athletics programs be required to publish racial and gender diversity data for their departments, administrators, coaches, and athletes, similar to annual disclosures on graduation rates and gender equity. The Knight Commission's press release about the meeting today will be posted on our website. You'll all receive a copy, and we're ready and happy to take your questions. Please go ahead.
Ben Knuckles with the Associated Press. Mark Emmert said that major fundamental changes are needed in college basketball between now and this time next year in order to ensure the integrity of the sport. What do you think those changes should be?
I don't know if he said next year. I think he said this year. I thought he
Well, he
said
said this season. I don't know if he meant this season's about to start. I don't think anything's going to happen before next season.
We'll see. I'll just say broadly, the legitimacy, the integrity, and I would even say the relevancy of the NCAA is at stake now. And let's just take, we don't really talk about specific cases, but, 2 high-profile cases recently. One where there's now, criminal charges and folks potentially going to jail, and no one knows, but that's probably the first shoe to drop. There are probably others coming, where the NCAA didn't seem to be aware or engaged, was on the sideline. And then there's a case of, I think, fairly well documented academic fraud over not a year or two, but over 2 decades, and the NCAA is on the sidelines there. So that's not a good place for anyone to be. And so I think that the themes that we'll always come back to is integrity. What is the NCAA going to do when players are being bought and sold and traded like commodities? What's the NCAA? What can the NCAA do? I'll just, again, use the word alleged, where there's alleged academic fraud. And I laid out, I think, very specifically, having some ability to play in that space, I think has to happen. The idea of all this being self-assessed and self-determined clearly is a massive, I believe, a massive flaw in the system.
And while we are not ready to make specific recommendations, we will seek an audience with the Rice Commission about ideas that we have in several important areas. For example, the non-scholastic youth sport arena, where there's essentially no regulation, the overall issues related to the recruiting culture and the corruption that we find there, more enforcement tools for compliance and enforcement within the membership organization. Those are the areas that we believe will be worth exploring as we work as a commission and take some ideas forward to Condoleezza Rice's group.
Thank you. Adam Zalanka, Capital News Service. In talking about giving more regulatory teeth to the NCAA, do either of you feel that the federal government has any role in that in the future?
You want to take that?
I don't think we're ready as a commission to give up on the very, very long-standing tradition in American higher education of self-regulation, but clearly recent events suggest that there need to be some more checks and balances, that there need to be some more opportunities to confront and identify some of these issues. Other organizations have tools that we don't have, subpoena power, for example, and that's one of the reasons that we'll focus in our further discussions about ways that the NCAA might improve compliance and enforcement.
Just one quick thought, and this is, I related a little bit off, but my former Department of Education and current, every administration, we give out about $175 billion in grants and loans each year. That's all of us as taxpayers, our money going out. And if that money is going out to places where there's academic fraud being perpetuated, is it worth considering? I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if it's viable. I don't know if the current administration would be interested. But is there a way to recoup some of that money that went to coursework that wasn't real?
Greetings, Keith Adams from the CK Save Project. President Emmert talked a lot about self-governing and how challenging that's been. In addition, he talked about maybe some student athletes shouldn't look to go to college based on their career aspirations, and David Robinson had mentioned that any opportunity to go to college is a good one. The question I'd like to ask from the Knight Commission's perspective is, in terms of youth sports, what are your thoughts on helping student athletes find a better balance between academics and athletics, especially when a lot of the youth sports are working with people who are not educationally trained as educators, but they're trained more within their sports?
I think you heard an impassioned statement from several of the commissioners during the meeting about the value of the opportunity to get a college degree and what that means throughout a lifetime in terms of your employability, your wage earning, your health, your longevity, you name it. There's a list of benefits from a college degree. And I think the underlying recommendation from those individuals who spoke out during the meeting was that we need to do a better job of marketing that opportunity. When you have 75% of students in Division I expecting to go pro and less than 2% actually go pro, we should be marketing the value of that education opportunity much more aggressively than we have been. And you heard that from Len Elmore, you heard that from David Robinson. They spoke eloquently about it. That's certainly a part of the solution, and it has to start at age 6, 7, 8, and it has to involve parents who are helped to see what supports are there so that you can have a great experience and that you can play sports and set yourself up for life.
I think Carol said it perfectly. I just add one quick thing, and I just want to put on the table very overtly that for first-generation college goers, for families coming from poor backgrounds, for Black and Latino students, this is a life-transforming opportunity to go to college and get that degree that Carol talked about. For the next 60, 70 years of your life, your opportunity structure is different, not just for you, but for your family, for your generations to come. And if the goal is to go to college to become a pro athlete, we're selling a bill of goods that isn't real. The goal is to go and hopefully have a fantastic student athlete experience, get that diploma, walk across that stage, and then walk into the rest of their life with those leadership skills intact. That's for me, the transformative impact of college sports. And as Carol said, we can't do enough starting very early to really talk about the real value of being on a college campus, being part of an intercollegiate team, and opening up a world of opportunity that your family, maybe for generations, has never had.
I'm Dan Kane with the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I had kind of a couple questions. Number one was whether or not you think that this recent College Basketball Commission should take up the questions raised in the North Carolina case. And then number two, I wanted to ask about, this was a situation where the accrediting commission said, these classes had, no academic integrity, also hit the school with a lack of control over college athletics, and still the Committee on Infractions said, we can't go there. Were they really handcuffed, or are they just fearful of being in a position where, athletes could sue the NCAA over, shoddy educations that were provided them by schools?
I was on the panel. You know that, no doubt. So I will reiterate what's very clearly spelled out in the public infractions decision. And the panel made a very strong point at several places in that public report of noting that the university, following the receipt of the, sometimes called the Weinstein report, sometimes called the Cadwalader report, but following the receipt of that report and working with their accrediting agency, they stood up in public forums and said, this was egregious, this is serious wrongdoing, and they accepted the term that the accrediting agency used, academic fraud. When they came before the Committee on Infractions, and this is the language we used in the report, they pivoted dramatically. They said that was a typo, it wasn't correct, that they believed the courses were legitimate, that they were taught by real faculty, real work was submitted, the work was graded under the supervision of a faculty member, the grades were legitimate, they stand on the transcripts, and they counted for graduation. With that in front of us from the institution, we had to go to the core principle of who has the right to judge academic legitimacy. And the current NCAA rules clearly say that is the institution's business, not the NCAA's business. That's where we were. And you can, and as I'm sure you have, you can read more detail and embellishments on that core theme throughout the public report.
Should this new commission...
According to President Emmert, the commission has free rein to look at any issue that they believe is relevant to these larger matters of the recruiting culture and the overall operation of college basketball. It will be up to them to make that decision.
Would you make that suggestion?
It certainly, as we go forward to talk with them, we will reinforce the recommendations that we're making today. And one of them is that the NCAA needs to modernize that rule.
Thanks. Steve Berkowitz from USA Today. Arne, you touched on you touched on the antitrust exemption. I just want to clarify where the commission stands on that. I'm not sure whether or not you're saying that's something that should be contemplated, whether or not this is something that you're recommending. I just want to clarify
Yeah,
your
no,
position there.
contemplated would be as far as I would go, and obviously it's complicated and you have to go through Congress, but I think we just, as the status quo clearly is broken. This is a time when all options should be, on the table. Integrity is at stake, relevancy is at stake. Where do we go? And so that is one of many things that should be considered. And there's no silver bullets, and that may not difficult, may not be the right way to go, but it should be one thing that gets looked at.
And we've looked at it in the past. So we've already done a considerable amount of research and background work. We're in a different environment now than we were when we looked at it before, and so we'll pull it up and take a careful look at it again.
Hi, Jeremy Bauer with Inside Higher Ed. I'm curious whether you think some of these recommendations, I know you don't have specifics outlined yet, would have any momentum among the member institutions, particularly considering the current system is pretty beneficial for them, and specifically the coaches?
I would challenge whether it's beneficial. Institutions are losing. They're losing in the court of public opinion. So, coaches might be getting wealthy, individuals might be benefiting from the current system. But ultimately, if you're losing in the court of public opinion, if you don't have credibility, that's a bubble that's going to burst at some point. So it's easy on the short term to say, okay, this is great for me, and I get that. But when the public starts to lose trust in these individual institutions, and as Mark Emmert was was honest, made himself vulnerable in it, public losing trust not just in individual institutions, but in the NCAA itself, I don't think that's a spot anybody wants to be in. And so you can think short term and keep riding that as long as you can, and maybe a few folks will get wealthy, or you can sort of figure out how to get to a better place. But that's not a position I think anyone in the public space wants to be, of declining public confidence in what your core mission is and what you're about, in declining trust in your ability to carry out your purported mission.
I think it's worth noting that the Knight Commission has a history of taking on tough challenges, making recommendations that individuals thought were going to be extremely tough to get through. We've been very persistent, relentless about promoting some of those ideas, and gradually individuals within the governing structure have been willing to step up and take leadership, and we've made changes. Getting the academic incentive in the basketball distribution formula was very significant. And it starts small, but it builds to real money. And we had to keep at it so that presidential colleagues who are part of that governing structure saw it as something that was important to do. And we'll take that same approach with whatever we determine will be our recommendations in this new world.
Graduation rates too, if you want. Graduation rates for March Madness.
Yes, the benchmark about having to graduate at least half to be eligible for the tournament, that was another heavy lift, but we took it on and we did it. So we're not afraid of those kinds of issues. We just know that there's a big persuasive job. We have to lead by influence. We don't have the power to make these things happen, but we're committed to staying with it.
I want also along those lines. Over the past few years, a lot of what the commission has done has, in comparison to what it did in its early days, where it was taking on some really fundamental stuff back at the beginning. That over time some things have changed and it's not been quite as much. What I'm hearing you guys talking about today are challenging once again some really fundamental points in the way you're talking about the relevancy of the association and the public confidence. Do you have a sense? I mean, I don't know historically whether or not you have a sense of this, but you know how big of a deal you guys sort of find yourselves, or how big of a place you guys are finding yourselves today in what you're seeking?
That's a very difficult question to answer because there's so many different components to it. But let me say that we started with presidential leadership and were effective in changing the early stages of the governance structure to get more presidential involvement. We moved then immediately to academic issues, and I think everyone will agree that we had significant influence in the changes that the NCAA has made over time on a variety of academic issues. Certainly the data that I shared about more graduation, et cetera, relates to much of the work that the Knight Commission pushed early on. Then we moved to the financial issues. Those are much tougher because of the antitrust issues, but we've been looking for ways to continue to get involved in those issues. Now we have a slightly different landscape with the FBI and those allegations, and we'll go back to our core principles of focusing on the student athlete experience and integrity in college sports, and look at how we can leverage our previous experiences and our influence to make a difference there.